Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Canary, a radio producer and host here at WGCU Public Media. Welcome to our Blood Sugar Rising virtual discussion. I understand many of the audience members joining us tonight have already seen the PBS documentary Blood Sugar Rising, America's Hidden Diabetes Epidemic, that serves as the foundation for this evening's discussion. But if you have not seen it, you can watch it online later for free anytime. Just go to pbs.org/bloodsugar, and we'll also provide attendees with a link afterwards. To start things off this evening, I want to introduce our guests. Dr. Brittany Bregman is a fellow in pediatric endocrinology at the University of Florida Health Shands Children's Hospital. Dr. Bregman, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a physician at UF Health and happy to be here.
Can you just real quickly just tell us a little bit about how your world overlaps with diabetes? I think it overlaps as much as anybody's here probably, or more so than everybody here.
Sure. So I am a doctor who takes care of kids with diabetes primarily. So that's my primary job. I'm also working towards being a clinician scientist in type 1 diabetes in particular. And so I'm doing research to investigate some of the ways that type 1 diabetes develops. So those are kind of what I do. And I take care of kids with all types of diabetes. So type 1, type 2, and other types.
Gotcha. Okay, next is Dr. Mark Pettis. He's Director of Population Health and Community Care with Berkshire Health Systems and is Associate Professor of Medicine at University of Massachusetts Medical School. Dr. Pettis, thanks for your time. Can you explain just a bit about your connection? Your specialty is nephrology. Explain what that means to the uninitiated.
Nephrologists are specialists in kidney diseases and high blood pressure, and certainly one of the most common causes of kidney disease is diabetes. And so many people that I care for are adults that have kidney disease as a consequence of diabetes. Population health is an extension of that, and models of care that attempt to prevent and more effectively manage disease. And certainly, as we will be talking about, diabetes is very much the bullseye on the target of population health in most communities, certainly the one that I work in.
Gotcha. Brian Schroeder is founder and CEO of Preventia Group. Brian, thanks for your time. Just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Preventia Group.
So again, yeah, I'm Brian. My work at Preventia Group is really centered around kind of that population health side that Dr. Pettis was referring to. My work within the diabetic population is really focusing on not just diabetes, but cardiometabolic disease in general. My immediate interest in building Preventia is what I've found often in clinical practice is we build lifestyle-based interventions for patients or programs centered around lifestyle-based interventions. They're often difficult to scale into our underserved communities or into rural populations or disenfranchised communities. So my interest is finding ways to utilize the power of technology to better connect patients to those resources that we saw in the documentary that are very often difficult for them to access. So how do we help patients better access the care that they need between those doctor's visits to maintain and sustain their behavior change and give them the access that they deserve? And then also, diving more deeply into the nutrition component of it and the healthy meals. We saw that as well in the documentary, that it's not always easy for patients to be connected to healthful meals that are in their communities. It's more, what's available and what's easy. And I think that's a really powerful thing that we can do. So that's really the main interest of my work is around access to both those two things, care and nutrition.
Great. Great. Thank you. And we're also joined by Joe Bilovich. He's co-founder with his wife, Tammy, of the Naples-based nonprofit Help a Diabetic Child. Its mission is to provide insulin and diabetes supplies to underserved kids with type 1 diabetes. Joe, welcome. Did I get your description right, or do you want to add a little bit to it?
You're muted, Joe.
Sorry, guys. So you covered everything pretty well, Mike. We're just happy to be here and proud to have each of you on the panel with us. Thank you to Ann and to you, Mike, for having us join.
Yeah, thanks to you all. And for everybody watching, this type of Zoom we're on means you can only see and hear us, and we can't see or hear you, but you can ask a question at any time. Just use the Q&A function. You'll see at the bottom of the screen. It'll pop up here, and I'll be able to bring your questions or comments into our conversation. So I watched the documentary. I learned a lot. I felt like I knew some about the world of diabetes, but I don't really know anybody who has it, so I've never really been around it. So I definitely learned an awful lot. But what I want to start off with is the increase in the number of cases. It said something like a generation ago, it was 3% of the population. Now it's somewhere on the order of 10% of the population. Dr. Bregman, can I start with you? Can you explain what's known, in the medical community about what the primary drivers are for this trend?
Yeah, definitely. So in kids, there's been an increase in both type 1, which is an autoimmune form of diabetes where the cells that make insulin don't work anymore. So there's been a pretty steady increase in type 1 diabetes. There are a lot of research studies going on right now to try to figure out what's driving that increase. And there's a lot of theories. But unfortunately, right now, we don't really know what's driving that increase. And then there's also a large increase in kids with type 2 diabetes, which is a diabetes where your body can't use the insulin as effectively. And that, it is definitely strongly driven by genetics. So there's a strong genetic component to type 2 diabetes as well. But a lot of that is coming from our environment, basically the foods that we eat, access to healthy play areas, outdoor spaces. Those sort of things are driving a lot of that development of type 2 diabetes.
Is there anything known, and I don't know if you can answer this or if Dr. Pettis can jump in, is there anything known about, does somebody who has type 2 diabetes, will they have a kid who's more likely to have type 1, or is there a connection there?
There is not that I know of a connection between type 1 and type 2, but actually someone who has type 2 diabetes has an even stronger connection, that their kid might develop type 2 diabetes. A lot of people don't realize there is a strong genetic connection with type 2, but there is, strong family history a lot of times where, if you have a kid with type 2, their mom, their grandma, their, grandpa, a lot of people in the family will have type 2.
Dr. Pettis, so from what I understand, 95% of people with diabetes in the United States have type 2?
That's correct, Mike. And as you alluded to, and as the documentary was so profoundly compelling, is this really has been an explosion over the last generation, the likes of which goes far beyond what any genetic model of disease could explain. And so we know that the changes in our environment, particularly the changes in our food supply, where the average American adult is consuming predominantly processed foods. And we know that as much as 55% of the foods that the average American eats on the standard American diet are processed carbohydrates. These are refined flour, sugar. They have very high sugar or glycemic effects. And these are also powerful in their driving of weight gain. And we know that the explosion of type 2 diabetes really correlates quite strongly with the epidemic of obesity. And while not everyone with type 2 diabetes is overweight, certainly the majority will have evidence for that. So the environment, food in particular, but we know that many environmental chemicals, toxins, you will find higher levels of persistent organic pollutants in the urine, in fat tissue of people who are overweight and diabetic. And our environment now is just loaded with chemicals that, we're all canaries in the coal mine. And I think we're really seeing a perfect storm of changes in environment that are overwhelming our ability to function in a more balanced way. And diabetes is a striking example of that.
There was a quote there at the end. I don't remember what the gentleman's name who said it, but he said that we're living in a world that's perfect for making diabetes flourish. Brian Schroeder, can you chime in there? Because I know, you were explaining that part of what you do is getting people to have access, but then also part of what you do is try to get people to, eat right and do the right things. Can you just, reflect on that idea that we're living in a world with, like, we've made a world for ourselves that is perfect for diabetes to flourish.
Yeah. I mean, it's the if you look at the blue zones, if you're familiar with the blue zones concept, where there's 7 places in the world where populations thrive and longevity is the highest. And even in some of those areas, the older adults tend to be the groups within those communities that are the healthiest. And what you're seeing is the younger adults who used to be skinny and you're used to, have a healthy weight and be thriving, are starting to be the highest percentage of those that are obese and they're obtaining these cardiometabolic diseases and diabetes. They're becoming diabetic because there's been an Americanization of the food culture in these other countries. And I think as we see that continue to happen in the United States and expand into into our underserved communities, that's what you see when you drive into an underserved community and when you explore in there, is that, with 26.5 million Americans living in a food desert without access to real healthful food, it's a big problem when the only thing they can reach for is something that comes out of the convenience store. We're not doing enough work to connect those that are living in those underserved or I guess even rural communities, to connect them to healthful meals and to give them the access that they deserve. And now with this pandemic, you're seeing this migration of remote workforces that are going and working from home. So not only is there access to nutrition a little bit different than it might have been before, but it's also their access to care. And that's just creating a big problem just across the board.
Fair to say, though, that even people who have good access to good food are often making the wrong decisions too?
Yeah, absolutely. My wife is an example of this. She is the reason that I do this work. 7 years ago, after she gave birth to my daughter, she was diagnosed with heart failure, which is cardiomyopathy. And a lot of that had to do with her lifestyle. And it was very difficult for her. We had the means to be able to connect her to health coaches, dietitians, people like that could help her. But at the end of the day, when we talk about whether or not diabetes is genetic, of course, a piece of this is, but also a lot of it comes down to habit. If your parents ate a certain way, then you eat a certain way. You do the things that you learn as you grow up, and that's the way you cook. Those are the types of things you eat. And Dr. Pettis could talk a lot about this when it comes to epigenetics and nutrigenetics and what that's rooted in. But in my wife's case, it was a manner of self-efficacy and education. So she knew she needed to make a change, but she didn't know where to begin. She needed somebody to help her with that. And we had the means to do that. So if you can imagine how difficult that might be for someone who does not have those means or does not have the access or suffers from social influencers of health that don't really allow them to connect easily to our systems, how difficult that might be for them.
Dr. Bregman, when you treat kids who come in, their parents bring them in, is there generally, do the parents, are they cognizant of the fact that their kids haven't been eating well? Because it's a little different when you're an adult, you're making the decisions, but when you're a kid, your parents are making the decisions for you oftentimes. And is it something that the parents are surprised? Or is there sometimes, parents are type 2 diabetics as well?
Yeah, I think there's a mix. So I know that, there are a lot of factors where it's just, how everyone's grown up around them and just how everyone eats around them, how everyone drinks around them. I am, a lot of people are very shocked that juice isn't actually good for you. So I do get that a lot because parents think that they're helping their children by giving them orange juice and by giving them apple juice because it comes from a fruit. So they think it's, great because it's fruit. But, when I tell them when they give their child juice, they're spiking their blood sugar so high that their insulin levels are kind of going through the roof. And I go through how much sugar is in there. A lot of people are very surprised by that. So that's kind of the starting place is that one easy fix for people is just getting rid of all the sugary beverages around them. So, a lot of people are surprised by that. Other people know, fast food is not the best for you, but, they're just so constrained by time. If you have a mom who's working 2 jobs, she's just trying to keep, her kids fed. She's doesn't have time to cook, so that, there are a lot of lifestyle constraints where even if they know that they're not making the healthiest choices, it's really hard for people to change some of those things too.
So type 2 diabetes historically was called adult onset diabetes. About when did that start changing to kids being included in that, more often than historically speaking?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say probably within the past 10, 15 years, it's really gotten a lot more. Even during my fellowship, I feel like, which has just been the last 3 years, I'm seeing more and more type 2 diabetes. Even recently, I've been seeing a lot more new diagnoses of type 2 diabetes. And in kids, it's actually more severe when they get type 2 diabetes. So sometimes by the time they come to me, it starts off just being a problem with using the insulin that you make, but once it gets to a certain point, it actually kills your beta cells too. So it can be pretty severe by the time it comes to us, but it's definitely been going up.
Does it definitely track along with the rise in obesity in our culture?
I would say yes. I think Dr. Pettis would probably be better at answering that question.
Okay, yeah, if you jump in, Dr. Pettis.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely correlates very strongly. It again, not that everyone with diabetes is overweight. About 1 out of 3 adults may not be overweight in terms of their body mass index, but still be insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, diabetic. But there's a clear, strong correlation between weight gain, particularly around the midsection. We know that people who carry more of their fat around the midsection, and we call that visceral fat, because somebody with a large waist circumference will tend to have more fat internally. And we know that that's a very strong metabolic driver of high insulin resistance, and pre-diabetes and diabetes. So very strong correlation. And often as people lose weight with whatever strategic plan they're using, you will often see significant improvements in their glucose sugar control.
Brian Schroeder, I want to pivot to you now. Can we just talk some about the way technologies have, added ways for people to manage their diabetes, to do testing and monitoring and stuff like that? It seems like it's probably come a long way just even in the last decade or so because of the way, smartphones and remote technologies have, exploded.
Yeah, I think that what you've seen is there's so many different people working to solve this problem, and they're doing a really good job, leveraging the power of the difference really between telemedicine and telehealth. Telemedicine is this very clinical intervention where, you're meeting with your physician and it enhances the access to care. But then there's telehealth, which is a little bit more all encompassing, where we can look at wearable devices and blood pressure cuffs and the glucose monitors and all that thing, where the data flows in and gives us real-time access, which it ultimately can be shared with practitioners so they know what's going on with the patient. Again, I believe a lot of this is about between visits. So what's happening with the patient between visit? And I think the evolution of this technology just keeps getting better and better. The data and the analytics that we have at our fingertips, even in real time right now, is far surpassed where it was 10 years ago. And then on top of that, with the increase in the utilization of telehealth, especially now with COVID, where it's growing 80 to 90% year over year, you're just seeing patients become more comfortable with it. They're getting used to using it. The older populations are used to even connecting with their grandkids, via FaceTime. It's just something people have become accustomed to using and become more comfortable with. And I think that if we leverage that a little bit more and just kind of go all in with it and wrap our arms around it, we're going to see more and more benefits from that technology.
And anybody else jump in on this one too, but can you guys imagine a future where, it is possible just for everybody who has diabetes to have constant real-time feedback, giving them exactly where their, blood sugar levels are in a way that will set off an alarm if it goes too much in the wrong direction?
Absolutely. And I know Dr. Bregman, a lot of her patients will have lots of data on insulin pumps and all kinds of real-time data. And I'm seeing this more and more in adults. The continuous glucose monitors are more accurate. They're very easy to use and to learn how to use. And it's quite revealing what you see when you can begin to look at things in real time. Foods that you might not have predicted would raise your sugar as high can be really attention getting when you have that data. Meal timing, eating a meal at a certain time of day, later in the day, close to bedtime, will have a very different feedback than what you would see eating a meal earlier in the day. Sleep quality, stress. So people really begin to connect what's happening in their lives with these metabolic manifestations. And it can be so helpful in guiding how one begins to look at the choices they make and how powerful they can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone with diabetes should have access to a continuous glucose monitor. I think it's one of the biggest advances in technology that's really helping people that we have. Right now it's hard to get it covered by insurance if your patient's not on insulin. And so I think that's a big change that, our healthcare system should try to change. Is I think it's helpful for people just to see what foods they're eating that spike their blood sugar, even if they're not on insulin. Like I had the great benefit of wearing one of these at a conference just to show me, how it works. I don't have diabetes, but I got to wear it. And, that conference, like bagel and croissant food, I could see it spiking up my blood sugar. So I think every person with diabetes should be able to have access to this technology.
This might be a strange comparison, but I'm reminded of a story I heard where they did a test where they put a monitor on the wall of people's kitchens that showed them exactly how much electricity they were using. And simply by being aware of that, the people who had that used less electricity in the months following. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's that constant awareness that lets you not, like the gentleman in the documentary, Montel, I think his name was, who he seems like he really wanted to do good, but then he kind of fell off to the side, which is probably something that a lot of patients do. But if he was getting, every time he picked up his phone, he was looking at it, that may have been a real good driver for him.
Definitely. We know that kind of feedback can be a motivating factor in behavior change and altering, how you select food and various other things. And people can have sugars that are not in very good range and still feel well up until a certain point. So there is a silent manifestation of this, and you can really pick up a lot in that range with that kind of monitoring.
Joe Bilovich, I want to bring you in now from the Naples-based nonprofit Help a Diabetic Child. Can you talk some about insurance? What gets covered, and what are the things that you're trying to cover because things don't get covered?
Well, first of all, we don't deal with any insurance.
I know. I just figured you might be able to explain.
Absolutely. But to hitchhike on the CGM, what Dr. Bregman said and Dr. Pettis said about CGM, up until very recently, CGM was not affordable. We were not able to cover the cost of it because it was so expensive. But very recently, there's been some new products that came on board that actually make it affordable, and very, very nearly everybody should be able to have a CGM through organizations such as ours. Mike, we see most of the referrals we get are from individuals who either have no insurance, have insurance, but they've got an enormous deductible. It might be $5,000 or $6,000, which might as well be $5 or $6 million to these individuals. They are in between jobs. Mom or dad has just lost a job, and the child's insurance went with it. So consequently, we receive the phone calls from schools, from people like Dr. Bregman and Pettis, from hospitals. And our responsibility is to just purchase these things for these kids to keep them as healthy as they can until the professionals can find a better way, a better cure. Our son was diagnosed 10 years ago when he was 16 years old. And when he was diagnosed in 2010, a CGM was probably somewhere around $8,000 or $10,000. Now a CGM that does effectively the same thing is about 1/10 of that in cost. He had insurance, never wanted to wear one, but now that he's recognizing exactly what you just said, I love the analogy of the electric meter on the wall. I can't tell you how many of the kids that we have given them to said, I never realized that rice does this to my blood sugar. I never realized that if I eat an apple, I need to give myself more insulin, or I've given myself too much if I had 2 slices of pizza. And I know that doctors Bregman and Pettis hear this all the time, and Brian as well. But that has made a significant and substantial change in how blood glucose is managed, for the better, certainly.
So what would happen? I mean, if a kid doesn't have, his parents don't have insurance, his or the, insurance, what about like Medicaid? Does that cover this?
It does. Yeah, it does.
In
Oftentimes,
Florida,
in
not
Florida.
all,
Yeah,
not all
everywhere,
Medicaid do.
but in Florida it does. Yep. But not all of them have that. They don't have the access to it for one reason or the other. They may or may not be. They may be migrant workers. They may not be here all the time like they should be. They may be undocumented. They may have not registered some way, one or the other. So they have no access to it. And I can tell you that we live in an area here in Southwest Florida that is one of the wealthiest and one of the poorest parts of the state, as you know. And just a few miles east of us is an area called Immokalee, where most of the migrant families live, and they are up against the wall in not just this, but food insecurities. You mentioned about the generational food thing going on. I spent an afternoon one time at a food distribution center, and most of the people who came were Hispanic, and on one side of the line was fresh vegetables and produce and fruits. The other side was pasta rice, beans, and potatoes. Well, by the time they came around to my side, I was on the pasta side. No one had anything green or orange or yellow in their basket, but they asked for 2 bags of rice and 2 bags of beans. And I asked one mom who was able to speak English. I said, "Why aren't you having any vegetables to cook for your little boy, who actually was about 3 feet tall and he's probably just as wide as he was tall?" And she said, "Because my mom only taught me how to cook beans and rice." And when you hear that and see that, it's stressing, because Brittany, you talked about the mom who works quickly, who works and needs to get food to their children. I mean, you drive past a fast food place, you can get 5 burgers for $5 and a giant Coca-Cola, and that feeds everybody. But just because they're eating doesn't necessarily mean they're being receiving the nutrition that they need.
Yes. And we find this often. If I could just add to that excellent point that you made, Joe, that when I look at our food banks, a large percentage of people who come through have very limited knowledge and skill with respect to meal preparation, and don't know what to do with a lot of that food. And I think that's why medically tailored meals, which I know is something that Brian and Preventia, part of this model, is such an exciting and important intervention, is that people need help, not only understanding what quality food is, but what to do with it once they have it.
Exactly. Yep.
Brian, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are phases to this, the way I see it. One of the things I used to see when I used to work for the second largest safety net health system in the United States, serving underserved communities. And what we found in the food pantry model is that, God bless the food pantries for being there, but if we would write a food prescription for a patient in a lifestyle, medicine-based model or practice, they had a number of social determinants that would limit their ability to even get to the food pantry in the first place. And what a lot of people don't know is, once you make it there, if you've taken it 2.5 hours down the bus line to get to the food pantry, once you receive the ingredients, they're heavy. A lot of the patients that go to pick up these things, the boxes weigh 35 pounds. So they have to find a way to get it back to the bus with a walker and then get home. And at the end of the day, even if they know how to cook and prepare the meals, they probably don't know the portion sizes. And even if they do, a lot of our patients only had microwaves. So at the end of the day, how do you teach someone how to make fresh and healthy food with the microwave? Now, you can do it. The education needs to be there. It can be done, but it just creates so many challenges for the patients, which is why I have such an interest, like Dr. Pettis said, in these medically tailored meals the supply chain that has been built by Walmart and Amazon and all of some of the other large giants allows us the opportunity to do shipping. So what I'd love to see is, the SNAP dollars or the food stamp, the monies that we have, give the opportunity to have patients get medically tailored meals delivered to their home and have that paid for. And a lot of times these medically tailored meals are based on clinical diagnoses and they're heat and eat. And what this does is it gets patients going down a path where it may not be a replacement of every meal they have, but it slowly changes their palate and helps them understand that this is better for them. It allows them to monitor in real time with the technology what is happening to their body. And then by engaging in things like health coaching and other types of providers, they can coach them down the path to recovery, but teach them the sustainability in this model, how to cook this stuff for yourself, how to prepare it, how to actually get the portion sizes right. But we have to do this in phases. And medically tailored meals is a really great way to do it. And so I'm really interested in that component of it. I'm looking at doing some pilots around that with some major health systems. But we got to get more buy-in from the health system community, who often doesn't trust the science behind food. These things just often do not intersect in healthcare and food. They live in separate universes. So we've got to get the key stakeholders behind this and really put our money where our mouth is when it comes to getting these programs put into place.
It's really interesting because, we haven't really had processed food for, just one little tiny blip on the radar when it comes to humanity. And yet it's kind of taken over everything in a negative way. And now you're saying that the medical community doesn't want to cross those lines in a way. So it's like, well, back to what I said before, we're living in a society that's perfectly tailored to diabetes.
And I wouldn't say that they don't want to. I would say that they don't necessarily know how to, or maybe they don't have the infrastructure. The human capital that you need to invest in people like coaches who services aren't often reimbursed. It's difficult to financially justify having enough people like that on staff to meet the demands of the patients. So that's what we have to figure out, is to create scalable solutions where we can still connect patients to care, knowing that there are limitations on scale for the health systems. They're all looking to solve this problem. They just don't know how.
Dr. Pettis, so about 10% of people in this country have diabetes. Is that the statistic?
It's approximately 10% on average. There'll be some parts of the US, like the Southeast, where those prevalences are even higher. And we haven't really spoken much about pre-diabetes, but we know that diabetes lives on a continuum. And often a person, before they meet criteria for diabetes, will have evidence, often for many years, of high sugars, but not quite to the degree where you would diagnose them as diabetes. And that's about 35% of the general population. So when you look at pre-diabetes and diabetes, you're looking at almost 45% of the American population. And people are saying, by 2025, I think the documentary touched on this, you're looking at as many as 50%. 50%. So it truly is an epidemic of grand proportions.
Where does it fall in terms of cause of death in the United States?
Well, diabetes as one of the primary drivers of cardiovascular disease, which is the most common cause of death in the US, approximately 500 to 600,000 American adults each year die of heart disease. That might be a heart attack, that might be heart failure. And it's the cardiometabolic risk factors, pre-diabetes, diabetes, high blood pressure, that drive those mortalities. And so it's right there. It's one of the most common causes. And I think we now know that it's a very preventable and in some instances reversible driver of mortality.
And all these things we're talking about are what they describe as these comorbidities when it comes to COVID-19. Dr. Bregman, I want to go back to you. We were talking before we started this, and you said that you had been seeing some patients, some children with COVID. How does that interact with diabetes, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I have, so I'm in training still, and so I get get to take patient phone calls overnight. And so I have had quite a few patients who are even at home calling me with COVID, who have type 1 diabetes. I would say in general, kids with, the studies have really shown that kids with type 1 diabetes don't have increased risk at this time from, having like death or morbidity or anything like that from COVID. From what I've been seeing, it's kind of like every other virus. So kids with type 1 diabetes do have issues with controlling their diabetes during illness, but as long as they're staying on top of things, staying hydrated, taking lots of insulin, it's definitely been manageable for most kids. The kids with type 2 diabetes that I've been seeing have also, done relatively well. So I think, there's still a lot of research in that area. And there aren't a whole lot of kids with type 2 diabetes. So it's still kind of a big area of research. But I think most of the complications with diabetes and COVID are in older adults who have type 2 diabetes.
And Dr. Pettis, what can you say about that?
Yeah, very much so. I exactly what I am seeing. And if you look at a diabetic with poor control compared to a diabetic with excellent control, somebody with poor control could have as much as a 10 times greater risk of mortality from COVID. So there's a clear, very strong connection between insulin resistance diabetes and one's immune system's capacity to manage an insult that COVID and other viruses like influenza can threaten a person with. So these are huge drivers, and it speaks to the importance of COVID as a threat, indeed a threat to all of us, but the extent to which we can empower ourselves and reduce our risk of the magnitude of that threat is very much within our hands if we begin to think about it in terms of risk and to what extent can we modify those risks.
The young lady in the documentary, she had kidney failure because she had not done what she was supposed to do. How common is that?
So I see most of these kids. So it's actually very common, especially in the teenage and young adult population. So, I mean, if you think about when you were a teenager or a young adult, kind of some of the questionable decisions that you might have made, now give yourself the total responsibility for being your body's pancreas, at 14, 15, 16. It can be really difficult for kids. And there's a lot of psychological issues like, kids wanting to take shots in front of their friends, kids wanting to let people know that they have diabetes. People like one of my coworkers has type 1, and even other doctors would look at her and be like, oh, you're going to eat that? Don't you have diabetes? So people don't want that kind of stigma. So it can be really difficult for especially the teenage population. And so we do see a rise in hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of how your diabetes is doing, especially in like the teenage and young adult population.
What about in grown-ups, Dr. Pettis?
Diabetes continues to be one of the main causes of end-stage renal disease, kidney failure that requires dialysis, and hypertension frequently coexist with that. And these are devastating complications. I've been in the unique position. Both my parents were diabetics. Both my parents had kidney failure, and both my parents were on dialysis at almost the same time. It was an extraordinarily horrible scenario, and so again, when you begin to look at this as a potentially preventable disease, particularly from the perspective of those profound end organ complications, which often include the eyes, which often include the heart and circulatory systems, diabetes is unforgiving in that respect.
I'm going to read a question here. I don't know if it fits into this part of the conversation or not, but I'm going to get it out there, and I'm going to have to try to pretend to be able to pronounce one of these words. Is there any treatment for gastroparesis? Is that right? That has now advanced to the pancreas not secreting the needed enzymes to break down food.
Yeah, so gastroparesis is a very common complication of diabetes. It's a form of neuropathy where the nervous system is not able to create the rhythmic contractions of the stomach and intestinal tract. And there are newer agents on the market. Dr. Mark Pimental at UCLA is doing a lot of work in adults with motility problems. And, medicines have been around for quite a few years. In my experience, their effectiveness varies. Often people do need to eat more frequent, smaller meals because they simply can't handle the larger volumes of food. I think another interesting area there is the biome of the gut, this ecosystem of organisms in the gut that we're beginning to realize has some connection to the motility of the stomach and gut. And this is a large area of Dr. Pimental's research. And I think we're learning a lot more, and hopefully it'll lead to more treatments for it. It can be a challenging problem to manage.
The young woman, back to the person in the documentary, she did end up getting a kidney and a pancreas transplant. And was I looking at the screen right? Did they add a kidney to her effectively?
Yeah, so that's how it works. They don't take out the kidneys that aren't working anymore. They just add a new one that does work.
And pancreas as well, or did they replace the pancreas?
Yeah, they just add the pancreas. So you have your old pancreas and your new pancreas.
That is definitely the thing that I learned today that I did not know that was done that way.
It's very cool. So our group at UF is actually doing a lot of research into potentially, preventing type 1 diabetes with immunosuppressive drugs, and then, treating type 1 diabetes because it is autoimmune. So we're using a lot of the agents that are used in other autoimmune diseases to try to see if we can help prevent or delay the onset of type 1 diabetes. But, a kidney and pancreas transplant is one of the only known ways that we can actually cure type 1 diabetes.
Another thing it said in the documentary was that since about the turn of the century, there's been 1 million people who've lost a limb to diabetes. And that was shocking to me in this country. Can either you or somebody explain why it is that happens? I know with the gentleman in the documentary, he had an infection. Is that generally how it works?
Well, often infection will coexist with circulation problems. And that's really the heart of the cardiovascular complications of diabetes, where both the large and the very small blood vessels lose their ability to allow red blood cells and oxygen to flow. And the further downstream one goes, the more those effects seem to manifest. So when you look at amputations, whether it be toes, whether it be perhaps part of the lower leg, these are very common end organ complications that are circulatory. So frequently, these are individuals with high blood pressure, in addition to diabetes, very high cholesterol or high lipid levels. And so that perfect storm will impact circulation in a way that, particularly when infection begins to impose itself, amputation sometimes becomes the court of last appeal to keep that person alive.
Safe to say that not only eating well and thoughtfully, but exercising would be a key to, not only preventing type 2, but also just managing type 1 and type 2?
Yes, absolutely, Mike. And these are powerful interventions that work. And as I think Brian alluded to, it's the fact that food is medicine is still a concept that hasn't woven its way into mainstream medical thinking is a little bit troubling, because we know that these are powerful, powerful interventions. And of course, Dr. Bregman and I, and we would all add to that the importance of good sleep hygiene and social connection, a big challenge in the midst of a pandemic, loving, nurturing relationships, cultivating meaning and purpose in one's life, how we manage stress. These all become aspects of our biology that ultimately translates in a way that can be devastating or at times profoundly life and health promoting.
Again, everybody listening out there and watching, if you have any questions you'd like to add to our conversation, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. As we sort of head toward the end of the hour here, I want to talk about what somebody should be looking for in themselves to think whether they should be really seriously considering whether they might be pre-diabetic. Brian, can you start with that?
Whether or not they may be pre-diabetic. So clinically, I would defer, of course, to Dr. Pettis or Bregman on this. But having said that, one thing I wanted to just state: the prevalence of pre-diabetes is particularly interesting and also disturbing when we look at the fact that actually 33%, and somebody fact check me, but 33% of the population actually has pre-diabetes. But what's more interesting is 90% of them usually don't know it. And so when we think about what they should be looking for or what signals there are, it's interesting to me that 90% of those that have pre-diabetes do not know it. So what I would encourage people to do is to get their A1C checked regularly and see where you fall on that spectrum. Get your wellness checks. Get a primary care physician and make sure that you're staying on top of your health. But clinically, I would defer to the, of course, experts on the panel today.
Let's start with Dr. Pettis. I'll start with Dr. Bregman when it comes to kids.
I was going to say, this is actually a big deal in pediatrics. So there's, big campaigns and movements to try to prevent, severe presentations of type 1 diabetes, because, you can get very, very sick with the onset of type 1 diabetes if you don't know the early signs, because it can develop really quickly. But if parents catch it early, it's really helpful for kids and how they do. So, one big thing that my patients all say is they suddenly started drinking tons of water, just being super thirsty all the time. Like my colleague who actually has type 1 diabetes said she used to have to pull over at gas stations on her way home from school just to buy something to drink. She was so thirsty. So that's one big thing. Kids who are wetting the bed suddenly at night that didn't used to wet the bed, having to urinate a lot is another big thing that can happen. And then a large amount of weight loss, which, people with type 2 diabetes are trying to lose weight a lot of times. So they're like, oh, great, I'm losing weight. This is wonderful. But if you're losing weight rapidly and not trying to lose weight, that's another big sign. And my kids with type 2 diabetes, one of the really early signs even of pre-diabetes is darkening of the back of the neck. So I have a lot of moms who come in and they're like, I have, my kid, I swear I washed their neck. I'm scrubbing it, but this dark stuff won't come off. And actually high insulin levels thicken the skin on the back of your neck and it makes it appear darker. So if you notice that your child has this dark ring around the back of their neck that won't scrub off, that can be a sign of a very early development of, eventual diabetes.
Dr. Pettis, what about in adults?
In adults, certainly the frequent urination and insatiable thirst are also very common, particularly when sugars are getting quite high. Certainly blood testing, as Brian alluded to, either a glucose, a blood sugar level, a fasting level, or a level after eating. There are well-defined values above which we would say you have pre-diabetes or diabetes. The hemoglobin A1C is another blood test that looks at more of a time average sugar over the last few months. And that too has a well-established set of thresholds where one could define that. And I really like, I'm a little bit of a renegade on the adult side, that I do often look at insulin levels, which many adult practitioners don't see much value in. But we know that insulin levels will go up long before a glucose level goes up. And we can talk about pre-diabetes and diabetes in adults being approximately 45% of the population. But if you used insulin, which goes up before any of those things change, it's probably even much higher than that. I believe those numbers are actually conservative. But blood testing is a very easy thing to do. And the last thing I would say is there is a certain body habitus, a body type that we would refer to as metabolic syndrome. So if a man has a a waist circumference of 38 inches, 40 inches or greater. A woman who has a waist circumference of 34 to 36 inches or greater. Most of that research has been done on Caucasians. That might look a little bit different in a Hispanic or Asian population, but having a large belly certainly is a body type that might more strongly predict a prediabetes or diabetic condition.
As we sit here tonight, is there any reason to think that these trends aren't going to continue to keep getting worse, in your opinion?
In my opinion, there's no reason to think otherwise, which is sad and disturbing for me to say. That said, I think we know enough to know now that there's so much we can do to bend this curve, certainly in adults with respect to type 2 diabetes. There's a lot we can do to be bending this curve. And these are the public health challenges. These are the population health challenges that Brian was alluding to, and understanding that if you're in a lower socioeconomic stratum, if you're an ethnic minority, if you're food insecure, if your health literacy is limited, you are looking at a much, much greater risk. So we need to understand that and to modify our systems in ways that can begin to fundamentally address that in those individuals.
Brian, you mentioned earlier the blue zones. That's places where people live unusually long. Is that what that means?
Yeah, it was a study by a gentleman named, I may get the pronunciation wrong, but Daniel Buettner, who traveled the globe and looked to define areas across the world where people live the longest. So areas like Okinawa and Icaria, Greece, and Loma Linda, California, even. And just studying the habits of those individuals. And what they found was in most of those cultures, people didn't really exercise. They just moved a lot all the time. It was part of their life. It was part of their nature. They were socially connected via tribes, within their community. They had a very strong sense of community, a strong sense of purpose. And so when you study these different things, and also most of their diets were usually plant-based in nature and included a lot of herbs and things like that. And so that general philosophical approach to life has just boded well for those communities. So we kind of study those and say, okay, what are they doing right? And what are we doing so wrong? And I think we're finding that it's just basic fundamental things. We need to be moving more, eating better, and stressing less. And in doing those things, that's pretty simple. And in those communities, you certainly see that they're thriving. But again, that's starting to change, as the years have passed. McDonald's and Burger Kings and the Pizza Huts of the world have come into Okinawa. So the younger populations are becoming more obese and the prevalence of diabetes is going up. So even in those communities, things are certainly changing.
Joe Bilovich, I want to bring you back in. So you are doing this what is the scope of the kids that you're helping? Is it just Southwest Florida, or is it just beyond Southwest Florida to some degree?
No, it's pretty much the entire state of Florida. And we've expanded out to north to Alabama. We've helped some kids in Pennsylvania. It's kind of like wherever the need is for right now, but we're trying to keep it as much as we can focused to Florida. We have a branch in Daytona and one here in Naples. Is designated as a blue zone.
Are there similar, nonprofits like what you do? Or in other words, is the needs way more than the ability to provide?
We haven't found another nonprofit, and we've been fortunate that we've been able to stay well enough funded to not ever have to say no to any child or any request for referral.
Go ahead.
Oh, I can say that we really, really appreciate everything Help a Diabetic Child does. We have many kids who are on continuous glucose monitors who otherwise wouldn't be able to access that technology without this foundation. So, and even their insulin, if we're in a pinch in terms of high copays, high deductibles, we didn't really get into the cost of insulin, but it's insane. And a lot of people have high copays, high deductibles, those sort of things that prevent them from being able to pay for these things. So their foundation, I've used them many, many, many times to help my patients.
And I want to do the price thing real quick. So in the documentary, it said that the person who invented it gave it to Eli Lilly with Is there a generic insulin? Is there possible somebody could come in and just make insulin and sell it at cost? Or is that,
Yeah, so unfortunately there are different types of insulin. The type of insulin that works best, definitely for kids with type 1 diabetes, was invented, in the 90s. So it is a newer type of insulin.
It's not that same insulin, right?
But since the 90s, the price has, more than quadrupled, and the insulin itself hasn't changed. It's the same insulin that was made in the 90s. So it's really, it's tragic really that, insulin should be like water, because people need it to live. If they go without it, I can tell you, if they go without it even for a day, they'll end up in the hospital. So, so the amount that the prices have increased is just unacceptable.
Dr. Pettis, you've been doing this for a while. Have you seen that trend, and how can you reflect on it?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I have seen that trend, and I've seen the extent to which it impacts the lives of those who require insulin in their day-to-day management. Like many pharmaceuticals, as demand goes up, these prices can get quite high, and sadly, there's a market for it. And not just in diabetes, but across the board, there are medications that can become so prohibitively expensive that it will ultimately interfere with an individual's ability to acquire and take them in a sustained way. It's just another part of our American healthcare system that is just very troubling and disturbing.
Do you have any sense of how insulin would be handled in some place like the UK?
Yeah, so I can answer that a little bit. A lot of other developed countries have either a single payer healthcare system where the government directly negotiates with pharmaceutical companies. And so because they have such great negotiating power, they can really negotiate the prices down. And then other places, basically it is just, they're able to negotiate the prices down much lower than we're able to negotiate them down here. They also don't have these giant, middlemen, basically like the pharmaceutical benefit managers, and all these different, if you look at how our healthcare system works, it is just kind of a convoluted mess. And it's really hard to track anything. There's no transparency. So everyone can just point fingers at the next guy to kind of say, well, they're the ones who are making all the money. It's not me. And then it's really hard to actually find out where the money is going and what the key issue is.
And just to be clear, the other countries that are, getting the cost down, it's from the same three companies.
Yes,
Pretty much.
that's right. You can go north of the border or south of the border and get the same medication at a fraction of the cost.
Mm-hmm. We have another comment and a question here. Thank you for the panel. I loved the info and especially the CGM history. Our teen has a Dexcom CGM and an Omnipod pump. Is there any hope for the costs of these medical devices coming down even more in the future? Anybody can answer that?
Maybe I could start, and then if Joe has anything to add, I would say definitely yes for the CGM. There's a lot of competition coming out in terms of people inventing the best CGM, and so Dexcom's competing with Libre, and there's other brands coming up as well. So I think as there's more brands competing, the price generally will hopefully come down. I know it is very expensive still, so it'd be great to see the costs come down for that. I think for pumps, it's probably similar, whereas more types of pumps, more brands of pumps come out, there will be lower costs.
Joe, do you want to jump in there?
No, I agree with Brittany. We've learned that over the past 10 years since our son was diagnosed that the prices have pretty much not a complete vertical rise, but they've gone up steadily. For example, a vial of insulin, we're told in India, the same vial of Humalog that we pay almost $300 here for is about $3 for the same exact product, and it just has to do with the way it's negotiated. There are multiple middlemen, people in between the cost and where it ends up. But I see the cost of CGMs coming down simply because of the competition, and that's good for the patients.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all the time we have. I just want to ask one last question. I asked earlier if you could imagine a time where every person who has diabetes was getting real-time feedback. Can you imagine a future where everybody is getting real-time feedback on all their biosigns and, you know, wearing their Apple Watch. And if all of a sudden, you know, your blood sugar goes high, you get an alert or something like that. Is that in our future?
I believe so. Yes, absolutely. And we're seeing many examples now beginning to emerge. Often these are telehealth monitors. You put a little patch on, it's the size of a Band-Aid, that can measure many, many things. That technology is quickly evolving. And I think we're all going to, in the future state, have opportunities to measure many things in real time.
Anybody else want to chime in on that before we sign off?
I would just agree that we're moving towards that world. I don't know how excited I am about it. For myself, you know, but you know, like Dr. Pettis said, there's all different types of devices. There's pills you can swallow with cameras that, you know, monitor everything you're doing. There's microchips that can be planted under the skin, and these things can actually Bluetooth into the technology already that we have at our fingertips. So yeah, I think we're going to make some serious advancements over the next years.
It definitely feels like we're closer to Star Trek now than I would have guessed 20 years ago, I think, where you can just scan somebody and it shows you the thing. Well, anyway, thank you all for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who's been watching as well. Our guests, thank you to Dr. Brittany Bregman, Dr. Mark Pettis, Brian Schroeder, and Joe Bilovich. Thank you guys all for your time this evening and for you know, sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And again, in case anyone watching has not seen that documentary, Blood Sugar Rising, you can find it for free at pbs.org/bloodsugar. And we will also provide you a link to watch it there, or I think there's a couple other places you can watch it. And other than that, thank you all very much and have a great evening.
Good night.